Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. So today I'm going to present a little bit around the world of ESG, which in some cases is sort of synonymous to sustainability and how we build sort of a world in the future in which we want to live. And this is really very much sort of a guide to companies sort of starting out today, whether in the fashion industry or otherwise, and hopefully relevant to some of you here. I know we're a little bit short on time, so I'm going to try and run through as much of it as possible. But just a quick introduction about us. So Wellstreet is a venture capital company. My name's Jess. I'm a partner and fund manager at Wellstreet. We invest in early stage companies in the Nordics. Don't let the British accent fool you. We're based in Stockholm and very much focused in the Nordics. And yeah, I mean, we're industry agnostic, but have made a lot of investments in brand, e-commerce, and also the circular economy. We are not an impact investor. We are a commercial investor. However, and hopefully you'll hear from the presentation today that we believe that to some extent all businesses should be impact businesses tomorrow, and that sustainability should be built at their core. So very much at the core of our DNA is customer experience, data-drivenness, and sustainability. We're early stage, hands-on, and focus very much on commercialization and revenue first. And then in terms of how we perceive sustainability in the investments that we do, because we invest so early, typically we're the first financier in a business that was started sort of within the last 12 months. We often get pushback that it's too early for an entrepreneur that's just setting up to think about sustainability, but we don't agree. We think that it's precisely at that moment that sustainability needs to be baked into how a business is built, and it should be part of their DNA from day one. It's the responsibility of the entrepreneurs and all of the stakeholders in the business to make sure that they have control of the potential and also real impact that they have and could have in the societies in which we live. And I think like when it comes to ESG, and I'll introduce the topic a little bit broader, it's not only about the company itself, but all of the potential effects it can have on the world at wide, specifically when it comes to the impact of the products and the services that they offer. So we see very much ESG and sustainability as fundamental and as binary. Companies that don't consider this will essentially cease to exist because they will lose their license to operate. However, of course, you need to approach this from the right and appropriate level based on the stage of the company. So just so we all align here a little bit today, what is ESG, or what do I mean by ESG in this presentation? As I'm sure you all know, ESG stands for Environmental, Social and Governance. It's a more or less agreed upon framework, at least at the European level, that helps stakeholders of a business understand how a business manages risks and opportunities, environmental, social and governance criteria. The ESG framework is much more than just environmental aspects, but looks at all of the potential risks a business faces when it comes to its long-term viability and success, to make sure essentially that the business continues to have its license to operate in a regulatory and societal landscape that is evolving based on the world's expectations of how businesses are run. The acronym ESG appeared actually for the first time in the late 1980s in a report from the United Nations. And the reason why there's no clear definition of ESG and why it's a fluid concept is that actually it's the result of very long, drawn-out debates and compromises essentially between the international community on the political side and business and corporate actors. And that's why the concept is fluid and it's still one of the most hotly debated concepts in the sort of corporate and securities law sort of world. But essentially, ESG is about minimizing impact as a whole, and sort of fitting the definition of sustainability around meeting the needs of existing generations without compromising the needs of future generations. I've included on this slide the SDGs, which I'm sure you've all seen time and time again, and these are often used in a business context. However, from sustainability going forward, I think it's our firm view that they're not helpful in the business context, precisely because they don't actually offer a framework or transparency or any way to measure and manage impact. And I think, as we heard from Mauro's presentation earlier today, what we're trying to do is achieve a baseline where we can essentially have transparency and also comparability as sort of the baseline. So you won't see the SDGs in the presentation today. I think a lot of businesses are using them more on an opportunistic side. Okay, if we don't actually use water, then we can say, you know, clean water and sanitation is an SDG we're contributing to. it's kind of a red herring and there's no sort of real ways to measure it. So hopefully today I'll show you a different framework, which I believe is much more useful. Just quickly then, when we talk about impact, we are always talking about impact in two ways in the context of ESG. First of all, and quite obviously, the impact that a business entity has on the world, but also really important to bear in mind the impact the other way around, how a changing world, when it comes to impact, can actually affect a business in very real terms. Impact can be direct or indirect, it can be actual or potential, of course intentional and oftentimes unintentional, and positive and negative, and it should be considered across the entire value chain, which you're obviously already seeing in the fashion space, as we heard already today with, for example, the digital product passports. When it comes to the materiality of an impact, that's also very important when you talk about ESG, so you sort of understand sort of the scope of it. So materiality is loosely defined as sort of a combination of like the scale and scope of an impact together with its likelihood and also whether it's reversible, i.e. is the damage, can you sort of backtrack on the damage or is the damage permanently done? So this is what we mean when we talk about impact. When it comes to ESG issues, every business is affected by ESG, even sort of software companies or companies that don't touch material things. And here are some sort of examples, and this list is not exhaustive, but actually gives you an idea of like all of the things that ESG encompasses. I think we're very used to seeing the ones that are in bold up here, things around data privacy and security, diversity, equity and inclusion has become sort of a topic that's been deeply talked about. On governance, we're talking a lot about sort of board composition, and then the business resilience, the supply chain and management, which is relevant to you guys here. But there's actually a whole host of other issues that businesses can look at from day one. It can be quality assurance and product safety. It can be employee satisfaction. It can be how the labor force is handled, and also simple things like risk management, which typically young businesses are terrible at doing. So all of those sort of are encompassed within the topic of ESG, which means that essentially businesses are affected, I think, always and in some way, sort of broadly in some of those areas. But this is to illustrate a little bit, sort of put some meat on the bones of what I mean, at least with ESG. Now, why is it important? I don't know if I need to make this case here, so I'll flick through it quite quickly. But I think we're all very much aware of the pressure that's being faced by businesses from their stakeholders to incorporate elements of sustainability, whether it's customers, regulators, investors, employees, and general and civil society. The risks are real. I think we saw that as well from Mara's presentation when it comes to regulation. So it's not only a reputational risk anymore, but there's a serious risk of non-compliance, losing actually potential revenue. And first and foremost as well, when it comes to financing investment and the different sources of investments, which I'll cover in a minute. On the flip side, there is a huge opportunity for businesses and entrepreneurs who take ESG seriously from day one and bake it into their business, essentially from the beginning. These companies can have a huge competitive advantage in so many different ways, whether it's financing, customers, and the like, and can really sort of leverage being a business that handles its ESG and at least sort of handles its negative impact in a positive way. I think you're all aware of like how the media is really focusing on ESG in many ways, and I think like this is really important for companies that actually are looking at impact from the start. And from the businesses here today, if you're building a business, whether it's a fashion brand or even a software company looking at new circular business models or minimizing impact, unfortunately the businesses that make claims around impact are the ones that are subject to more scrutiny, because the whole basis of the regulation is actually to sort of stop greenwashing. So the more you have a positive impact, the more how you handle your negative impact will be under scrutiny from society at large. And that's why managing negative impact within the framework of ESG is absolutely fundamental for the survival of young businesses. To introduce you quickly to the regulation. So the bad news is that as the regulation is progressing on the textile and retail industry, it's actually also progressing and coming into force when it comes to the financial industry. So financial regulation when it comes to how investors spend their money has also come into force and is sort of really hitting in 2023. It's kind of a complex landscape of regulation when it comes to regulating financial actors, but we're going to focus on this one over here, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which came into force in March 2022. They're doing some revisions this summer as well, but this essentially is regulation that regulates how investors spend their money and is trying to redirect capital flows towards sort of more sustainable businesses in general. So transparency is the name of the game. It's about establishing a standard on like how companies report on their emissions, but also comparability, which is hugely important when it comes to assessing an investment and the risks with that assessment. So transparency and comparability. And then financial actors essentially can categorize themselves as sort of different types of investors. But even investors that opt out of any kind of impact claim still need to do a sustainability risk assessment on their investments. So it's really coming into play at the moment, and I think like a really relevant regulation to bear in mind. It essentially means that all sort of asset managers start to really will need to understand the whole sort of life cycle of the products and services that their investment produce and put out to the market. Disclosure is really important, and also keeping up to date with the regulation is really important. Now, asset managers are typically just a collection of their parts, which means that us as an investor, we have a very minimal impact. We're a team of 13, we have one office, 1.5 at the moment. Our impact itself is quite small. But the impact we have when it comes to the money we deploy and the companies that hold that investment is huge. And essentially, the burden then of reporting passes down to the companies that are producing those products and services. And this is the really hard part, is that actually you're looking at like those businesses are the ones that need to start reporting. So the era of talking about sustainability and making claims of sustainability is over, and very much, as we saw in the parallels from Maro's presentation, it's really about sort of avoiding greenwashing and putting some meat on the bones and being able to show how you are actually working with sustainability. Again, so the SFDR is the regulation that aims to reorient capital flows towards sustainable finance. How does the regulation actually do that? So within the regulation, essentially, you have a key concept called the principal adverse impact, which are essentially the metrics or the measures of impact. And those, I think, are absolutely key because they're the actual reporting numbers or units when it comes to sustainability in the financial world. So when you see investors talking about how they monitor sustainability and talk about sustainability and collect data, they may dress it in lots of different ways, but actually what you'll see is the principal adverse impact indicators sort of baked into those networks, and that's all across the EU. So it is our firm opinion, and that's the framework that we've built it on, that essentially these principal adverse impacts are the most relevant framework for companies to report on ESG data, for companies that will be financed by capital, external capital within the EU. That could be grants, that could be government funding, that could be venture capital and the like. Those are the metrics that are the most relevant. And companies that report in that are essentially available to communicate in a way that is sort of comparable alongside where they're sort of speaking the same language as everybody else within the industry. Of course, you can't measure everything, and especially as a young business, so you have to adapt it to the size and the maturity level of the company. They're not always relevant, but all of them need to be considered. This is what they look like in a snapshot. So they're divided between environment, governance, and then social aspects, so human rights, labor rights, and anti-corruption. The toughest ones are always the environmental ones and the measuring of greenhouse gas emissions. That's probably the toughest ones. The other ones are fairly easier, although again, within the fashion context, sort of a little bit tougher on the biodiversity, water, and hazardous waste. And then the other ones are slightly easier, I would say, to monitor. So this is essentially the bottom, if you sum it up to sort of what should be measured in the context of ESG, if you want the measurements to sort of be relevant to the financial industry as a whole. In terms of the work that we've done, so we are registered under the SFDR as Article 8, which essentially means that we are not an impact investor. We don't only and exclusively in companies that have a positive impact, but we invest in companies that manage their impact on the world around them, and we hold them accountable to that. But I think most of all, we support them in doing that work. We've built essentially a whole framework that's a 3-level based system to essentially sort of upgrade grade the companies up the ladder towards a point where they're monitoring sort of basic things up to when they exit our portfolio to a point where they actually own their sustainability and start to actually find ways to have a positive impact versus just managing the negative impact. So the sort of levels work on the timeline of the companies sort of coming in to our environment, and the levels look like this. So essentially, these are the requirements that we set out based on the SFDR then, the principal adverse impact indicators, but also based on the industries and the expectations within the industries where we are heavily invested. The grayed out ones are the ones that are actually regulation, so from the principal adverse impact and the SFDR. The other ones are the ones we've sort of added where we feel like, okay, this is sort of best practice or already common practice in the industries in which we invest. And we think this offers companies sort of a good baseline, and then we sort of basically sort of handhold them through level 1, level 2, level 3. We want them to be at level 3 by the time they sort of graduate from us to a later financier or potentially an exit. And level 3 again is based on the criteria for later stage financiers and what they expect to see in an asset they might buy or might acquire. All of this material is available on our website as well, if you guys want to read more about it. And I appreciate I've run through it quite fast, but hopefully it's a useful framework. And then I just wanted to touch a little bit around communicating on ESG for early stage companies. Again, like as we've heard today, like a lot of the regulation and the frameworks being set up are about avoiding greenwashing, avoiding claims of sustainability that can't be backed. These sort of principles when it comes to communicating around sustainability are taken from the GRI, which is another regulation and framework around sustainability and ESG from the EU. But accuracy, balance, clarity, comparability, the context, the timeliness, and the verifiability and completeness are key principles in terms of how you communicate around sustainability. And if your communication doesn't follow these things, then it's better to not talk about sustainability at all. So we're taking things, I think, on a whole level in the financial world. A lot of investors themselves are not actually prepared for this. Similar to the brands in fashion, it sort of hit them in the face a bit, but it's coming and it's going to start to be implemented. So at the EU level, and then each sort of country it's going to be run by the financial authority or the financial inspection authority or the equivalent here in Finland. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.